So I've got the pleasure of talking about native stingless bees for pollination of crops today, but I will, because I'm the first speaker, I'll talk a little bit generally about native bees and introduce the topic. But first I'll mention a little bit about pollination in agriculture, an incredibly important process. So yields of 75% of our crop species are improved by animal pollination. 5 to 8% of total food production relies directly on animal pollination. You will hear estimates much higher than that. So if you want me to explain why that estimate's lower than some estimates that you will hear, then I'm happy to explain that. But that's taken from very good calculations. And there's a quote down the bottom for that. And although that may not be as big as 1/3 of total food production, it still is worth $350 billion annually globally. So an amazingly important process. Now, the agents that move male pollen to the female stigma, this process of pollination includes mainly flying animals, flying insects, but also birds and bats. And I'd just like to talk about a couple of those. Bees, of course, but before I go into bees, I will just mention that flies do play a role in pollination as well. So any of you who enjoy eating chocolate would be horrified to know that without the presence of small midges pollinating the flowers of cacao in tropical countries, you would have no chocolate. So just dwell on the consequences of that for a moment. But I like to think of bees as being professional pollinators because they feed their young pollen. So they're serious about collecting pollen, and that has led to the evolution of very close relationships between bees and flowering plants, the flowering plants being the source of most of the food that we eat. So that's why they are particularly important when we talk about this pollination process. And you can see the pollen on the abdomen and the legs of that megachile bee on pigeon pea. I'm not going to talk about the diversity of bees in my talk. I think that gets covered elsewhere. But of course, honeybees are enormously important pollinators. They perform about 1/3 of total biotic pollination, which leaves 2/3 to be performed by other insects, particularly bees. And bees are under threat. That's a very important point that I can't go past. That bees, there are some very serious issues that are threatening the populations and diversity of bees in natural areas and as well as our agricultural areas. So what is our plan B? It's to diversify away from and help to protect the broad diversity of bees. And I believe that's what we're here to talk about tonight, is to talk about how our native bees can help with that pollination of our crops. Now, I do want to make the point here that most bees are solitary insects. So if you look on the right-hand side of that slide, you'll see what might be a typical solitary bee life cycle. It's where a single female builds just a few cells and rears some young. Now, that's what the final three speakers are going to talk about tonight, but I'm going to talk about social native bees. So on the left-hand side, you can see inside a nest of social bees, and you can see there's very large numbers of individuals cooperating to in that nest. So to the point of my talk, can stingless bees be used as alternative pollinators for our crops, as in this case where we're attempting to do that using hives of stingless bees in a macadamia orchard? So I thought I'd kick off this topic by talking about the advantages and the disadvantages of stingless bees, in particular relative to honeybees as crop pollinators. So they're harmless. They really are stingless, and so they're harmless to humans and domesticated animals, which can be a real advantage. We've all felt the sting of a honeybee. The preservation of biodiversity. Generally, stingless bees we're using within their native range, so we are protecting them at the same time as utilizing them. Because there is a great diversity of species, then we can look at how their Their preferences for flowers, for example, might allow us to use them in specialized ways for particular crop species. Stingless bees are resistant to most, not all, but most of the diseases and parasites of honeybees. So if we do lose our honeybees locally, then stingless bees can step in and take up the slack. Now, they have short flight ranges. How can that help them? Well, the next slide shows an agricultural ecosystem, and right in the middle, we show a point where there might be a stingless bee hive and a honeybee hive. Now, the stingless bees forage much shorter distances. That inner circle is the foraging range of most of the stingless bees from that hive. And you can see how small it is relative to the outer yellow circle of honeybees. And that gives them then the advantage that gives the farmer the advantage that if he or she is paying to bring stingless bees onto the farm, most of them will stay within the boundaries of the farm. That inner circle represents about the area of a single crop, a single farm. This slide shows the diversity of honeybees at the top 10 species, but look at the diversity and the range of stingless bees. 500 species, hugely diverse in many parts of the world and in the tropics, which brings me to the next point, that stingless bees have some disadvantages as well. They're limited to warmer parts of the world. We can't use them, for example, for the pollination of our almond crops. And we do have some issues with limited numbers of hives being available for that job. And there is an issue that we're dealing with as well, which is that they can fight with each other when they're brought together for pollination. And you can see in that thick picture there, the death of a large number of bees because the individuals from two colonies are engaged in a fighting swarm there. To build bee numbers, we are limited. We don't have hundreds of thousands of hives yet to pollinate our crops. We need to overcome some limitations, and I've listed them down the side there. Hive design, we're still answering the question of what's the best hive design. How do we propagate our bees in the most efficient and effective way? Can we feed bees to make them do better, build up in numbers better, and do the job of pollination when we need them? How do we manage some of the pests and diseases that they face? And how can we manage them on farms to so that they're healthy, but also most effectively placed and managed for the job we want them to do? So for a case study of that is macadamia, where they're already in use. And another example is blueberries, but we'll come back to other examples later. Well, here's some other examples too. So you can see horticultural crops, particularly in subtropical parts of Australia. There's a few examples of crops that are effectively pollinated by stingless bees, and there's a potential there for the use of these bees in their pollination. So some of the things we might do to manage these bees better is to conserve habitat on farms. So this image shows on the left-hand side macadamia trees, on the right-hand side a strip of eucalyptus forest that helps it to provide nest sites for bees and also food when the crop plant's not flowering. And it also provides safe places for you to keep bees when you need to spray the crop, for example, because macadamias are rare, or they can't be produced organically. We do need to use insecticides for their production. We're looking more and more at using floral strips, where we plant strips of vegetation, flowering plants, to provide food for the bees. Here's an example of one floral strip, 3 meters wide, ploughed between the trees on the right and the bushland, trees on the left and the bushland on the right. That strip is 2 kilometers long. It goes all the way around some margins on that farm. And it's planted with a winter crop and a summer crop, and provides an abundance of flowers on the farm to keep those bees going when the crop is not in flower. Insecticide use is, of course, a huge issue for pollinating insects. And there's just a few of the management practices that a good farmer will take to avoid the impact of these insecticides on bees, which are, of course, insects as well. So I'll finish up. I think I must be close to my 10 minutes. Am I, Fiona?
Yes, you are, but that's okay. You're doing all right.
I'll finish up just by showing this slide, which shows some of the management options that we might use to maximize the value of stingless bees on a farm. So we protect our natural vegetation, whether it be riparian or a bit of remnant forest. We tend to space out our bees to avoid fighting amongst them and to maximize the microclimates that are available on the farm for keeping them. We keep the beehives outside of the crops to minimize impact with those insecticides used on that crop. So thank you very much for listening.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Tim. It's always such a pleasure to be able to hear from you and hear from all these other researchers. In the role that I play with Ween Bee Foundation, I get to speak to so many different researchers working in this fascinating field with all sorts of bees. And these webinars are such a great opportunity to be able to share with people more broadly just how much exciting work is going on. So thank you for sharing with us on that information. Now, please, everybody, keep your questions coming through on the Q&A function, because we will have a chance to ask all of our panelists at the very end. We'll bring them all up and we'll have a conversation and be asking them your questions. So keep your questions coming through. It's now my great pleasure to invite Julian Brown to come forward. Julian Brown is an urban ecologist, and he did his PhD looking at bushfire recovery and landscape management, and has a great interest in urban ecology, and is currently working with the Melbourne University as a research fellow. So Julian, you've got a fascinating story with some of the work that you've been doing in the Yarra Valley, and so please share with us and with everybody else what you've been doing.
So as Fiona mentioned, I currently work with the University of Melbourne in urban ecology, so looking at bees and butterflies and birds in the city. But before this, I was working with the Australian National University, working on the Securing Pollination project. And basically, we were looking at native bees as temperate fruit crop pollinators in and around the Yarra Valley in Victoria. And that research is mostly what I'm going to be talking about tonight. So I'll start off with why we should be considering native bees as crop pollinators, and Tim mostly covered this. But down in Victoria, where we don't really have stingless bees, when we look at what animals are visiting crop flowers, it's usually dominated by honeybees. It varies between sites, but it's often around 80–90%. And it's risky to rely on any one species for pollination, because if something happens to that pollinator, then you get a reduction in pollination services. So we need to enhance native bee numbers on farms if we want to safeguard against things like the establishment of varroa mite. So when we're thinking about what makes a good crop pollinator, there are sort of two main things to think about. First is whether it can act as an effective crop pollinator, so whether it visits the crop flowers, carries crop pollen, and deposits crop pollen on crop stigmas. But the second criteria that's important is that we can augment or manage the population size, so you have enough bees visiting crop flowers during flowering time. So with that research I was doing in and around the Yarra Valley, I was working on orchards and berry farms, mostly with apple, cherry, blackberry, raspberry, and blueberry. And basically over a few years of surveys, we found these 5 groups of native bees visiting the crops, each group having a number of different species. But tonight I'm going to focus on Hexanura, the reed bees, because of those groups, I think they probably have the greatest potential for management of crop pollinators. So we found them visiting all the crops we looked at, and we also caught individuals off crop flowers and identified the pollen they were carrying. And we found that reed bees were often carrying pollen from all of these crops. So that's the first 2 criteria for being good crop pollinator. And then we took the final step and did some experiments with blackberries to see whether they were depositing pollen on blackberry stigmas. So basically, we had a blackberry farm where we put little bags around the unopened flower buds, waited till the flowers opened, took the bags off, recorded the first insect that visited the flower, then put the bags back on and waited till the fruit developed, and then counted the number of druplets, which is a measure of fruit quality. And what we found was that on a single visit basis, so on average, a single visit from a reed bee, more than double the number of druplets that a flower would produce if it wasn't visited by any insects, if it was the bag remained on it for the whole flowering period. And what reed bees could achieve was slightly higher than what honeybees or other native bees could achieve, but not significantly higher. And then Olivia Bernal from James Cook's group, James is going to talk later, did similar sort of research with apples, but was looking at the number of apple pollen grains deposited on apple stigmas, and found a similar sort of pattern with the reed bees substantially increasing the number of apple pollen grains on stigmas compared to no pollination, could sometimes achieve higher deposition than honeybees, other native bees, but there was a lot of variation. So again, it wasn't significant. So the main point here is that reed bees are at least as good as honeybees at pollinating blackberries and apples on a per visit basis. But because honeybees at present are visiting crops much more frequently, they're providing the majority of the pollination service. This is in Victoria, where we don't have stingless bees. So now if we look at how we can augment pollination services provided by reed bees to crops, we need to know a bit about the basic biology and ecology of reed bees. So they occur from mountain forests down to coastal heathlands, but they're not very common inland where it's drier. They can live alone or in groups of up to 15, 16 females per nest. And you can actually get multiple nests in close proximity. So you can have fairly dense, fairly high densities of these bees, but not compared to a stingless bee or a honeybee. They're active all year round except winter, though you do sometimes see them foraging on a warm winter day. And like all bees, to complete their life cycle, they need pollen and nectar and suitable nesting substrates. So with our research in the Yarra Valley, we gained some insights into their pollen and nectar requirements. So they're quite generous. As I said, they're foraging almost year round. And where we were working across the suite of crops that we were working with, they didn't cover the full activity period of reed bees. So native plants before and after crop flowering were quite important for providing pollen and nectar throughout the reed bees activity period. So wattles and hakeas in late winter, early spring, and then things like native peas and kunzia after crop flowering in sort of late summer or autumn. So now looking at the reed bee nesting substrates. So this varies between habitat type. So up in the wet forests, they're mostly nesting in the dead fronds of tree ferns. Down in the heathlands, mostly dead flower spikes of grass trees, Antheria, Melaleuca branches, decaying eucalypts. And then in the modified landscapes, so agricultural landscapes, we often find them nesting in wild blackberry or lantana, or basically anything that's got a pithy stem. But regardless of what the nesting substrate is, they need to be able to access the pith. They can't burrow in through hard material themselves. So they'll nest in a tree fern frond when it falls off the tree fern. They'll nest in a blackberry cane when it's cut or snapped. So this is important for managing their nesting resources. So in terms of what you can actually do to promote reed bees on farms, one of the things we found in the Yarra Valley was that we would find a higher abundance of reed bees visiting flowers when there was more native forest in the surrounding landscape. And this is probably because the native forest has lots of nesting material in terms of tree ferns, but also provides that continuity of flora resource throughout the activity period. Then in terms of on-farm management, so I mentioned that we found more reed bees in landscapes with more native vegetation, but we did have one site with hardly any native vegetation in the surrounding landscape that had very high numbers of reed bees. And this was a raspberry and blackberry farm. And we actually found the reed bees were nesting in the rows of cultivated raspberry and blackberry in the old cane stubs that had been pruned in previous seasons. And so what we did was we then went around and cut up a whole lot of wild blackberry and bundled the canes together and put them in these PVC pipes and stuck them on star pickets. Put one of these at a site where we knew there were reed bees, and within a couple of months, reed bees had colonized it. Tried it at another site where we knew there were reed bees. They hadn't colonized it after almost 2 years. So there's still something to figure out in terms of their preferences for artificial nesting substrates. So just to summarize that, so that for the on-farm management, you need to ensure that there are flora resources throughout the activity period, so from late winter to late autumn. So you probably end up planting acacias, native peas, that sort of thing. And then ensuring there are nesting sites. So this could be tree ferns in the wetter areas. If you're growing raspberry or blackberry crops, leave a cane stub when you're pruning. Or you can try playing around with artificial nesting substrates like blackberry canes bundled together. And then finally, it might be possible to move to something like reed bee keeping. So back in the 90s, Mike Schwartz developed this artificial nesting substrate for studying the social behaviour of reed bees. Basically, it's a length of balsa with a tunnel cut in the top, and then a sheet of glass over the top of that for observing what's going on inside, and then a cover on top of that, cardboard or plastic. In the agricultural context, we wouldn't need the glass, obviously, but the benefit of having this cover is that you can take it off and remove parasites and predators and clean out waste to increase offspring survival, build up population sizes quicker. And you can also transport these around to pollinate different crops, but also to track flora resources throughout the activity period. And that's it. Thank you for listening.
Fantastic. I'm endlessly fascinated by just how much we don't know and how much the opportunity is for us to learn more through more research into these amazing native species. Thanks so much, Julian. So we'll definitely have some questions for you in a while. So everyone, keep your questions coming through. I'm sure that's prompted lots of questions. So keep them coming through the Q&A. The little Q&A function down the bottom of your screens. Now, so the next speaker is going to be Katja Hogendoorn. Katja's from University of Adelaide in South Australia, and she's a researcher there, a research fellow in behavioural ecology and the evolution of native bees. So we're going to a different cropping system now. So whereas Tim's talked about some of the subtropical crops, native macadamias, lychees, and we've heard about berries down in Victoria, Katja's going to talk to us about some different crops, apples and lucerne. So love to hear from you, Katja, please.
Okay, I'm going to talk about native bees in apples and lucerne in southern Australia, and specifically around Adelaide, of course, and around Keith, where most of the lucerne is grown, and how to look after them. But before I go on, I like to think of bees rather as stunning in their own right, and not so much as how useful they are for us or how can we deploy them to our benefit. Many of them need our conservation and protection, and we will see which ones they are as well in the course of this talk. So We've been looking for years on cherries and pears and apples and canola and lucerne and other crops in South Australia. And what we found is that on lucerne and apples, we have lasioglossum or furrow bees. We've got Lipotrichus or nomia bees. We've got Homolictus, Extranura, and Leoproctus. And on lucerne specifically, we've got leafcutter bees, resin bees, and blue-banded bees. So to give you an example of the efficiency, I measured for the little bee, the little Lipotrichus here, which is called the green and gold nomia bee, I think, how efficient it was compared to a honeybee. And on lucerne, it needs to be tripped, it was 30 times as efficient, but that is per individual. So honeybees come in lots of individuals, and altogether, native bees can help with pollination, but probably cannot replace honeybees fully. Although in some cases we found that there were 30% native bees giving the services. Okay, so how can we help all these crop pollinating bees? What I need to say is all those crop pollinating bees are generalist bees. Well, that is logic, because all our crops, or nearly all our crops, are introduced. And so the specialist bees are specialized on Australian native plants and generally do not go to crops. So how can we promote these pollinating bees? And Julian has already talked about that. We can give them shelter. We need to know how they nest and where they nest and what they need. And then we can work out how we can assist with twigs or bee hotels, or providing open soil, because many are soil nesting bees. And that's not what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about food. And as you can see, there are loads of food plants, but we can think about when do they need food, where do they need it, and what types of plants can we provide. So when do these bees need food? Well, if we think of a typical furrow bee, lasioglossum, very often they are active already in winter, warm days, or early spring, because they overwinter as adults. And very many of them have more than one generation, often two. So what you can see is they will need food from winter or early spring until midsummer. And the same holds for the nomia bees. The blue-banded bees are a bit later, because in South Australia, that is because they overwinter as larvae and they need to wake up during the warm days. So they are not the preferred apple pollinators here, because apples nearly finish flowering when they start, but they are very good for summer pollination of lucerne, because they are active until well until autumn. And resin bees are very often active during summer. And so basically, when you summarize that, you can see, well, there might be a period in winter where food is not that much needed, but we can safely say mostly year round, we need food for bees when the crop is not in flower. And where do you need that food? Well, we found edge effects in lucerne, and we looked at the pod set in lucerne and the distance to the crop. And what we found is we quantified how the set was relative to the distance in the crop and then relative to the average of the whole field. And we found edge effects to about 200 meters in the crop, which is similar to what Tim has for macadamia. And that means that you'd need floral resources within 200 meters from the center of any field, really. Okay, so that's where we need those floral resources. Okay, now, what type of plants? We caught bees on apple, and we looked at on what other plants we caught them on. We caught them on weeds and on native vegetation, just like you, Julian, did. And this is not surprising. Of course, these are generalist bees. In lucerne, we did it a bit different. We caught the bees on lucerne while they were foraging on lucerne and looked on the pollen on their legs. And what we found was that not only had most of them lucerne pollen, several had canola pollen as well from the field next door, and a number of native species too. So, but the interesting thing is crop pollinating bees collect pollen from crops, weeds, and native plants, but they often were carrying mixes of pollen. So I think that they might be obligate mixers and want several sources of pollen at a single time. Okay, now, of course, for generalists, you can do crops and weeds and native plants. But if we now want to, say, kill two birds with one stone, we could opt for native plants in the verges, because that way we also protect our non-crop pollinating species, which is about 70% of the bees. And this is where we're discovering the most new species. We're discovering new species still visiting crops, but we are very many species have not been uncovered yet, and we're at the moment describing about 90 new species. So there's still a lot to uncover. So the specialists are more under threat, and that is an example of a specialist is the golden PB. The golden PB around Adelaide only visits one genus of native bees, the Visia. And where that is not present, that bee cannot exist. So they rely on local native plants. So which plants then do you need to plant? Well, you can go to a local native nursery, and most of them know what are attractive bee plants. So you ask what local plants are attractive to bees, and then you select the ones that are easy to grow, because there's no point in growing something that grows really slow. But you can also look at the power pollinator guides for your area through the Wing Bee Foundation and select plants that flower long or at different times of the year. Select pollen and nectar sources to be present all the time, and that information is in the powerful pollinator guides. And add the eucalypt if you can, because they are so good for native bees. And then if there is no powerful pollinator guide for your area, well, you can still take the guide and use the same genus, but a different species. It's a good bet. So local native species are the best thing to plant. And that is all I wanted to say, really. I really thank the organizers for inviting me and you for your attention. And this was part of the same project as Julian was talking about. It's called Securing Pollination for More Productive Agriculture, and the whole report is available through the AgriFutures website.
Thanks, Katja. And it's a fabulous report with lots of really good information. So I'd certainly encourage people to go and have a look at that information. Thank you. Another dimension to the native pollinators, native bees and pollinators in the local landscape from different crops. So our final speaker, and keep your questions coming through. There's lots of great questions coming through, which I like to see. The next speaker is Professor James Cook, who heads up a team of researchers at Western Sydney University, where there's a lot of focus on native pollinators, not just bees, but wasps and flies and other alternate pollinators as well. But James is going to talk to us tonight about some of the work that they're doing at Western Sydney University with blue-banded bee, and in particular their use for glasshouses and polytunnels. So James, thank you. Welcome, over to you.
Thanks, Fiona and Candice, for organising this. Hope everybody can see my slides okay.
Yes, we can.
Good. So I'm very happy to be joining in tonight, and really enjoyed the first three talks. I'm joining you from the beautiful Blue Mountains, which is the country of the Darug and Gundungurra people. So I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. And I want to take you inside now. So the speakers so far have talked about bees, pollination in outside situations, which I am deeply fascinated by myself. But also a lot of our work at the moment is inside. And actually one of the largest, the fastest growing sectors of horticulture in Australia and worldwide is growing crops in glass houses and polytunnels. So these offer some advantages over the external sort of orchard or farm situation, because you can control things to a greater extent. You can shut out some things that you don't want, but you can also generate some other problems, including shutting out pollinators, which you may very much need to set the fruits and all the seeds that you need from your crop. So a challenge for horticulture is how to manage pollination inside. And an extra challenge is the case of buzz pollination. So this is a particular kind of pollination that's a bit more demanding. Not all insects and mostly just a few bees can do this. And it's particularly important in tomato crops and some other crops of that family, like eggplants and so on. So here are two challenges which are somewhat special over the general situation we have. And a possible answer to these problems is blue-banded bees, which are some of our most iconic and beautiful native bees. So I want to start, first of all, by just talking a bit more about protected cropping, which can be something as not a huge impact on the pollination system, like nets which are put over to protect hail damage or to keep bats and birds off in apple orchards. But even those can have impacts on key pollinators like honeybees. But we're particularly interested in what happens in a more enclosed situation with glass houses and even vertical cropping these days being some of the extreme cases. So a lot of our work recently has been testing alternative pollinators that we might use in glasshouse crops. And we're lucky to have a great big research glasshouse at Western Sydney University that's been built just a few years ago with a joint project with Hort Innovation Australia. So in fact, a lot of our early work has involved the stingless bees that Tim's told you about earlier this evening. And stingless bees are actually great in glasshouses based on our work so far. We can keep them in hives, and unlike honeybees, which are not good in glass houses because they don't like it, they spend all the time trying to get out, and they're also quite aggressive, so they can sting the people working in the glass houses. The stingless bees obviously don't sting. They initially don't like being in the glass house, but as the forager population turns over, they quite quickly adapt. And we found that they work really well in pollinating glasshouse strawberries. So we've had really good success, and even one visit from a stingless bee to a strawberry flower can make a big difference. And by the time you get 5 or 10 visits, you're massively increasing the production of high quality, top grade fruits, which is what the growers are seeking. And it's not just bees. So although we're focusing on bees tonight, I'd like to mention flies briefly. So the right-hand picture on my slide initially looks like a honeybee that's had a race tag number attached to it. But this is actually a drone fly. So it's a kind of hover fly that mimics the male honeybees and looks very like them, and is very similar size, and is also a great pollinator. So we found these are actually really good at pollinating strawberries, and they're used elsewhere in pollinating things like onion and carrot seed. So already we've found a couple of interesting native pollinator options for glasshouses. Stingless bees, like honeybees, are livestock. So you manage them in hives, you need to look after them properly, you need to feed them properly, and to keep them as a valuable resource to use from year to year. Flies are interesting in that they can offer more of an off-the-shelf, almost like a pollination treatment. So you can order from producers packets of fly pupae, and then you can hatch them out and release them into your glasshouse, and they fly around, feed and pollinate things, and subsequently die off, and you don't have a sort of ongoing livestock situation. So there are a couple of good options already, but the problem is that some crops cannot be well pollinated by stingless bees or flies. So some plants require buzz pollination. And what we mean by buzz pollination is a situation where the pollen on the anthers, the male parts of the plant, cannot be easily just brushed off or released. So it actually requires sonication or physical vibration. So if you think of the case of a salt cellar with the salt inside being like the pollen, you have to shake it and move it around to get that salt out. And this is a bit like the situation with buzz pollination. Now, quite a lot of plants need this, but it's definitely a minority. But it does include some key crops, and tomatoes are one of the biggest crops worldwide. It's grown pretty much everywhere, and they really need buzz pollination. So tomatoes and relatives like eggplants need it, but also some native plants such as Herbertias also require buzz pollination. So where do we find buzz pollinators? Well, it's essentially the domain of bees, and within Australia, we don't have lots of candidates. So honeybees don't do it, stingless bees don't do it, but blue-banded bees are very good buzz pollinators. They're not the only ones, so native carpenter bees and teddy bear bees are also buzz pollinators. So given this situation, we've just launched a new project, which is funded through the Hort Frontiers sort of partnership scheme from Hort Innovation with a bunch of other partners, both researchers and industry people, to see what we can do about further developing the use of blue-banded bees as managed buzz pollinators. So blue-banded bees are quite well known to people who like bees. They're fantastic bees. They look really good. They're quite large, they're fast, they're active. People tend to notice them, and they're fairly distinctive. The genus is Amygilla, or particularly a subgenus within that, Zone Amygilla. So the wider genus includes things like teddy bear bees. And in Australia, we have 14 species, but there are also species in Asia and Africa. And they are great pollinators. So Katja and Robert and other people have shown that they are really fantastic tomato pollinators. So bee for bee, they outperform pretty much anybody else who's been tried, even including bumblebees, which are the most popular tomato pollinators worldwide. Now, blue-banded bees nest in soft stone or mortar or in the ground in soil, and have the kind of nest structure that Tim kindly showed us earlier for a solitary bee. So some of the challenges with trying to use them more are the fact that these are solitary bees. So you don't get 40,000 bees like in a honeybee hive, or 10,000 bees like in a large stingless beehive. One female lays a few eggs and raises her larvae in a burrow, and you might get something like 5 larvae there. So a major challenge is to actually raise those numbers so that the individual advantage of these bees can then be harnessed at a sort of population level. Another challenge is that they are very seasonal. So Katja mentioned in South Australia, the bees overwintering as larvae and showing that they have pretty long flight period actually. So they're active from sort of mid-spring to even late autumn, but they're not active the whole year round, and the numbers vary. So if we're going to be able to use them widely and at a high level, we've got to overcome this issue of numbers and of the seasonal activity. So our project is trying to look at things starting with better understanding of the basic biology of these bees and moving through towards stages that will lead towards the possibility, if we get everything right, of commercial pollination. So in terms of developing fundamental knowledge, we need to know more about their nesting, their diet, their diseases, what foraging requirements and cues they use for foraging behavior, what crops they can pollinate, and then think about aspects of using them as managed pollinators. So how is the crop managed in terms of growth situation, in terms of lighting, in terms of chemicals, etc. And can we get beyond these problems of the winter lull of activity and rearing large numbers? So the blue-banded bees have been investigated quite a lot before in some respects. So particularly work from Anne and Les Dolan at the Aussie Bee Australian Native Bee Society, with their website aussiebee.com.au, have developed the use of artificial bricks for the bees to nest in. And Katja and Robert in previous work have also looked at their pollination behaviour in glass houses and breeding aspects. So what we're currently doing now is trying different types of artificial blocks with tennis clay loam or a sand and cement mixture, lightweight cement blocks drilled. And we're putting out these test walls in 15 different sites in Greater Sydney, where there is already very clearly blue-banded bee activity, either in the ground or in other walls, and then monitoring what comes to use these sites and also following those bees to see what they do. So some of the questions we need to ask are, what flowers do these wild blue-banded bees use as food resources? And we can do this directly by looking at them in the field, by looking at things like photos that many bee enthusiasts will post on social media, and also by taking the pollen off the bees and identifying that either directly under a microscope or using DNA techniques. We also want to know what attracts them to particular flowers. So these are quite generalist bees, as Katja's already mentioned, but are they attracted by particular color or patterns or smells, or just high rewards in terms of nectar or pollen? We also know that they're good pollinators of some plants already, and that they visit a wide range of plants, but we'd like to know better which crops they can pollinate effectively. And so far, experiments have mostly been with tomatoes. If we're going to keep them in the glasshouse situation and manage populations, it's also important that we can supplement their food with artificial feeders, as well as with planting extra non-crop flowers to feed them. So we need to see if we can get them to take nectar and pollen more regularly from artificial sources. And nectar is already possible, but pollen is quite a challenge. So in the glasshouses, there are several challenges for us. One thing we need to know better is how these bees forage, what cues do they use? So visual landmarks may be very important for breaking the monotony in some of these big glass houses. And if you think of tomato glass houses, then in South Australia, you have glass houses which are 20 hectares in footprint, and they look pretty much the same throughout that. The bees may also use olfactory landmarks, so chemical smells, and we can investigate the use of lures for that. And we need to know more about their temporal and spatial foraging patterns, both in the wild by studying bees in our sort of study sites, and also when we bring them within the glass house to see what they do in that sort of situation. Now, a general problem when you bring lots of any animal, or plant for that matter, together in one place is pests and diseases. It makes it easier to transmit pests and diseases between different nests. So we need to make more studies of the pests and diseases of these bees. And a big challenge will be whether we can actually move to year-round populations. So at least in temperate regions, currently we see a big winter lull with pretty much no activity, but some other blue-banded species in the north, in more tropical areas, can be active pretty much year-round. So there are a few different ways we can think of trying to explore that, either with differences across species or trying to manipulate a particular species by changing the environment they experience throughout the year. So to summarize, the blue-banded bees, at least in my opinion, are some of the most beautiful and iconic native bees, and they're found in most parts of Australia. They're great buzz pollinators on an individual basis, and they're exciting candidates for buzz pollination of glasshouse and other crops. But there are major challenges to solve, and these are particularly about rearing them and maintenance of captive colonies. So a lot of excitement about these very special bees, but also quite a lot of work still to do. So thanks to all the organisers and audience, and please do put some questions into the chat.
Thanks, James. Fantastic. I think it's just so exciting hearing from all of the speakers about these incredible opportunities that we have with these native species. So if I can get all of the speakers now to come forward and put your cameras back on, unmute yourselves, and we'll start to ask some of these questions. So everyone's been very obliging with some questions. There's some great questions coming through. So there's going to be no particular order. I'm just going to start at the top and go down, so I'm not quite sure where they're going to go. Now, there was one question about whether the slides would be available. This webinar is actually being recorded, so give us a week to do a bit of a cut and trim, and we'll have this available so you can watch it over and over and over again. So we will let you know when that's available. Now, question for Julian, I think. What's the foraging range of the reed bees that you were talking about?
Not 100% sure. So when we did that landscape analysis, where we found that there were more reed bees in landscapes with more native vegetation, we played around with measuring the amount of vegetation at a few different spatial scales, from 200 meters up to 1,000 meters. And we found that the reed bees were responding most strongly to the landscape pattern measured at the larger scale, the 1,000 meter scale. But that's not necessarily their foraging range. That could be also to be with dispersal as well. So not certain at this stage, but probably at least a few hundred meters.
Okay, thank you. Tim, to stop you from typing your answer, you're trying to cheat, aren't you? We want everyone to hear this. So for the bees that fight, how far apart should the bees be to stop them from fighting?
Yeah, sure. I just have typed a bit of an answer there. So not just
Gotcha.
it's not just a case of how far apart you keep them. So there's a couple of issues here. You're trying to minimize attack between hives, but you're also trying to minimize defensive reactions when hives think they're under attack. So the second part's kind of a bit easier to manage. So that's about managing drift between hives. So managing bees, minimizing bees moving from their hive and ending up entering another hive. So you can do that by marking hives. You can do that by transporting them in groups so that they get to so yeah, by marking hives, that's the best way to fix the problem of drift. But to fix the problem of them actually attacking each other, you can actually, they seem, and some work of Ros Gloag has addressed this, they seem to learn to live with each other when they're kept together and to sign a bit of a truce, if you like, and not and because they spend a lot of their time testing each other out for strength, I believe. And if they know other hives, then they tend not to fight as much. And if you keep them strong, keep them all strong as well. So if you're transporting them onto a farm, if you can keep them in blocks of bees that know each other, that's a useful technique to minimize fighting.
Great, thank you. There you go, and I saved you from typing the rest of that answer. One for Katja, there was a question, my native bee hotel is a bit like Hotel California, full of spiders. So if a bee does come to stay, they're not going to be leaving. What are your thoughts on bee hotels?
Yeah, I typed in a brief answer, but so bee hotels can be a problem because they attract ants. Ants are famous for raiding nests in bee hotels. They attract different kinds of parasites, which also deserve a life. And in general, if you don't want to boost the population of one species, as in the reed bee, you might not helping bees very much with providing a big bee hotel. So what I always say, plant bee food first. But if you do a bee hotel, it might be better to make a number of small ones, just a bundle of bamboos and put that somewhere under an eave or protected, because that way you spread your bees out in 3 dimensions rather than in 2, which the most bee hotels have. So it's fun to have a bee hotel. I have them, because when I get home, I like to see who's done what and who's active. But yes, they are a problem. They attract parasites and ants. I do, got to say, I do kill the ants on occasion.
Okay, thank you. One for James about blue-banded bees. What's the best material to use to make a blue-banded bee artificial nest?
Okay, well, so far it seems that we're having the best results with red tennis clay loam, so a mix that you can buy, and that seems to work pretty well. Other people have had some success with a sand cement mixture. The drilled blocks we're not getting much uptake with. So based on the current approach, which is developed from work that Les Dollin originally did, the tennis clay loam in that sort of PVC pipe works really quite well.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Another one here for Julian. Could the dead fern fronds removed from the plant still provide habitat for reed bees?
Yeah, certainly. Yeah.
Okay. And an extension of that, how do you expose the pith in trees for habitat purposes without harming the trees?
Yeah, so when you expose the pith, when you prune a branch, you're obviously going to kill what's above the pruning. There's no way to avoid that. But, you do it on branches that aren't going to cause any major problems for the entire plant itself.
Yeah.
And they don't nest in live material. They only nest in dead material.
Ah, there you go. So you don't have to feel guilty about pruning that little bit off. You're doing them a favor.
Yeah.
Okay, I've got another question. Not sure who's this. This might be for a bit of everybody. If I put a honeybee hive in an area where there are native bees, will they be in competition? What are the issues? Are there issues? What are they?
Yes, they will be in competition. Of course, honeybees come with very many animals and they're quite big bees, so they collect a lot of pollen and nectar. And assuming that there isn't enough, which is very likely, that means that the honeybees, which forage early in the morning and come from a warm hive, which our native bees don't have, so they, apart from stingless bees, they will forage when it gets above 20 degrees. Honeybees do that above 14 degrees. They will have collected a lot of the nectar and pollen sources that have opened up overnight.
So what's the solution?
Don't take a honeybee hive.
What's the other solution?
Plant
Lots
food.
more stuff.
Plant more food, yeah. Okay, James, one for you. Why can't we you mentioned that blue-banded bees are more effective than bumblebees, but bumblebees are very well established and used elsewhere in the world. So why can't we use bumblebees in Australia?
Yeah, well, bumblebees are also buzz pollinators, very good at pollinating tomatoes, and they've been, they're widely used in Europe. Catcher was involved in developing that, and there are other species which are used in North America, but they're not native to Australia. So we don't have native bumblebees. They have been introduced, we're not quite sure how, to Tasmania, where they're now quite invasive and doing very well as an invasive species. The difficulties there, so at the moment it's not legal to use bumblebees anywhere in Australia. And the issues are that they can compete with native wildlife. They're a social bee, not as big colonies as honeybees, but still a few hundred bees. They could bring in diseases, which could be a problem for native insects. And they're also, they've evolved alongside a lot of our major weeds, so may be involved in spreading and pollinating a lot of the weed species that we also don't want. So there are, although they are very effective as glasshouse pollinators, there are a lot of downsides to them as well.
Okay. And so if we are successful at being able to use blue-banded bees in this commercial glasshouse setting, is it only the plants that require buzz pollination that they are good for pollinating? Are they specific to those crops?
Well, again, as others have mentioned, most of the good crop pollinators amongst our native insects are generalists and will visit a lot of different things. So blue-banded bees are known to visit quite a wide range of different plants, but there's a lack of, there aren't many studies on testing whether all bees will visit plants not to pollinate them, but to get food. So that's why they're going there. The pollination is a side effect of their visit, which is good for the plant. So we have a lot of data generally on what plants any kind of bee will visit, but more rarely do we actually test experimentally in a good way if it's actually being a good pollinator of the plant. So the chances are that any generalist bee species, whether it's blue-banded or something else, will visit a lot of plants, but it will probably only be a good pollinator for some of those. So we need to test that further.
Okay, so there's a lot more work to be done.
Yes.
And what about, we're seeing on the news so much, and we're all experiencing how wet it is at the moment in this La Nina year. What's the impact of the current weather conditions that we're having on the blue-banded bee and in fact the other native bee species too?
Well, the weather's a real problem because, as we've just heard, so honeybees are really good at going out in most weathers, but a lot of other bees will not be happy particularly in cooler climates, and most insects prefer sunny, calm weather. So what we're seeing at the moment, a lot of in the eastern, particularly southeastern Australia, a lot of wind, a lot of rain, a lot of very cloudy days. This has been a very poor season for blue-banded bees getting started. We're just starting to see them in the last couple of weeks in the Sydney area, which coincides with the better weather. Mm-hmm. I think the best illustration I have is some work we do in the bilpin apple growing region, where most years we get lots of honeybees, lots of stingless bees, and small numbers of other insects. And this year we get lots of honeybees, a total of 3 stingless bees based on 10 days of surveying, and a lot of hoverflies, because honeybees and hoverflies are coping quite well with the nasty weather, and we're not getting those 18-degree days that you need for stingless bees to get out of bed. So the weather makes a really big difference to native bee activity, at least in some areas.
So if we go to Victoria and then go to South Australia, Victoria, Julian, what are you seeing in Victoria at the moment?
Yeah, so I mean, I'm doing my surveys in the city at the moment, and it's only really been in the last couple of weeks or last week even that I've actually been able to get enough data, to satisfy my boss in the surveys. There's just not much flying at the moment. So yeah, it's a similar sort of situation, and a lot of the so some of the wattles and things are finishing up, and bees like the Lesioglossum parasitacoides genus, which are usually early flyers and depend on those floral resources, are kind of missing out on their floral resources because the flowers are finishing up when they haven't had much time to fly around and collect pollen. So yeah, the weather is causing problems, definitely.
South Australia, Katja, what's happening in your part of the world?
I was supposed to work in apple orchards, amongst others, on native bees. I think there were 2 days warm enough for native bees to forage in apple orchards. So that doesn't help. So they are not there this year on the apple. They will come out later because they will stay there and it will get warmer. So that is okay, but there's not much to get in apple orchards anymore after the apples finish flowering. So that is the same problem as Julian has. On the other hand, if we have one of those years where it's very hot and we've got an October or early November heat wave, then everything turns into a crisp and there's no food either. So it never rains, but it pours, or something like that. Yeah, those bees will survive. We had that with the blue-banded bees in the years 2017, 18, 19. I was really worried because I wasn't seeing them anymore in the city. And it turns out that those heat waves done the trick, and they came back a bit during the subsequent years. So yeah, they are affected on both ends of the spectrum, let's say that.
Yeah. What about up in the more tropical, subtropical areas, Tim, up in Queensland? What's the weather doing for the native bees up there?
North Queensland's been fine for stingless bees. It's been quite a good year. They haven't had excessive rainfall, but in southeast Queensland, it's been a dreadful year for stingless bees. The worst, I believe, I've ever experienced in nearly 40 years.
And what's
so
been
from a practical point of
why has that been? What
excessive rainfall?
Yeah, okay.
And cooler conditions.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the rain, the impact of rain on social bees in particular, I imagine, is not only the fact they can't forage, but it's the fact that the resources get washed out of the flowers. And so bees spend a lot of time collecting diluted nectar, and then they've got to concentrate that nectar before they can use it. There's a lot of energy used in transporting, a lot of water, which they've then got to use energy to evaporate the water out of. So, and then the pollen is just most of it ends up on the ground. So it's unavailable to the bees. Plus the fact that they can't get out to forage as often, and the cooler conditions mean they're not breeding as quickly. Then we're probably seeing about half the numbers of hives that we would expect to be propagating right now in a state where we can propagate them. So yeah, it's been a really poor year.
Okay, certainly worrying to hear, and we can really see and hear the impact that the weather is having on these bee populations. There's another couple of questions here. Someone from Tasmania saying that the bumblebees are often seen pollinating the foxglove weeds. So I think reinforcing some of the concerns around buzz pollination and the additional weed burden that those invasive species can create. And there's another question here around, well, if we're not allowed to use bumblebees in glasshouses in Australia, what are they using to pollinate in glasshouses right now, James?
Yeah. Good question. And at the moment, what's used is a mechanical vibrator. So basically a shaking stick that they pay a worker, human, to go around and vibrate the plants to release the pollen. And that is one of it's a significant cost to the production of tomatoes in Australia. So it's quite a big issue.
Thank you. We're getting down to the last couple of questions, I think. Katja, how much vegetation do you need? You're talking about that additional vegetation. How much vegetation do we need when it comes to that extra vegetation?
Yeah, that's you could say the more the better, but that's not realistic in operational terms, of course. So what has been shown is that 20% of the surface is very, very good. You could, but it is what you can do, really. So that gives us some sort of an indication. We should, as a country, aim for 30% native vegetation to protect our biodiversity anyway.
Thank you. There's a question here about, do native bees pollinate avocado trees? We might throw that one to Tim, and you might want to comment on maybe if you've got avocados and lychees and macadamias all in one area, what's the impact of that on the preference of pollinating insects?
Yeah, sure. So avocados can be efficiently pollinated by native bees and honeybees and flies. So they are generalist in terms, we've talked about generalist bees. This is a generalist plant, and most crops are like that. So they can be pollinated by native bees, but native bees seem to have a relatively low preference for the flowers. So you're exactly right, Fiona, that often you'll see good numbers of native bees on avocado in an area until the neighboring macadamia farm, because they're often right next to each other, flowers, and then they're all off on the macadamia. They have a very high preference for macadamia, and that's a problem for avocado and mango and lychee and anything else that might be flowering at the same time. But you can also, and I mentioned how we can get maybe some more specialized pollinating services. And what we are learning more recently is that one of the native stingless bee species, Tetragonula hawkingsi, has a higher preference for avocado, and Carbonaria has a higher preference for macadamia. So we can look at utilizing those differences to maximize pollination of both crops in the same area.
Fantastic. So we're really getting to tailoring the pollination in a really specific way as we know more. That's fantastic. Look, one final question for Julian around the canes. What specific dimensions, you know, how, I guess it's the same with bee hotels and rubus canes, you know, what sort of depth or dimensions should these canes be for the reed bees?
So we found with the reed bees on the farm we were working on that they had a preference for canes that were less than 10 millimeter in diameter, and that accords with some of the research I've seen from bee hotels used in cities. It's usually they will nest in holes that are less than 10 millimeters in diameter. And then you usually need, you know, at least 15 centimeter length of depth in the whatever the nesting substrate is. Yeah.
Katja, with native bee hotels, is there you know, what happens if they're too short or they're too long? Is there a problem if they're not that ideal 15 centimeter depth?
There's not a real problem if they're too long, because the bees will plug it up. If they're too short, the bees can only make a few cells and then they have to search for another nest. And as far as diameters go, it varies, but there's a lot of advice out there. I generally say between 3 and 8 mils in diameter, something like that.
Okay, wonderful. Look, we've covered a lot of different questions. The questions have been fantastic. Thank you everyone for throwing all those questions up on the chat. It's made for a really interesting and fascinating conversation. I'd like to thank all of our speakers for giving up of their time this evening to share with us. It's been a great audience. There's been huge interest in this particular webinar, so I look forward to making it available for everybody to watch over and over again after Australian Pollinator Week. I would remind you that it is still Australian Pollinator Week until Sunday. The weather is certainly playing havoc on the Australian pollinator count as well, finding a stretch in the weather where it's not raining or blowing a gale so that you can actually see some pollinators. But I would encourage you, if there is a little break in the weather and you can get out there, do the Australian pollinator count and contribute to our knowledge and understanding of the abundance and diversity of the pollinators in the environment. So thank you again to all our speakers. I'll give you one last, if there's one thing you'd like people to go away and do differently, Katja, what would you like people to go away and do differently to help the bees? I'll go to each of you for your final word.
I've only got one message ever: plant bee food.
Plant bee food. Tim, if there's one thing you'd like people to go away and do differently, what would you like it to be?
We see a lot of inventiveness among our stingless beekeepers in designing new hives and new ways of propagating their hives. So yeah, keep at it. Don't give up.
Keep innovating. Keep bringing dynamic new ideas. Julian, what would you like people to go away and do differently?
Yeah, I agree with Katja, and I'd add that, you know, not all plants are created equal, I guess. So, and you know, depending on which bee species you're talking about. So a lot of our most, I guess, distinctive bees, the collettids, they will often only take pollen from our ancient plant lineages, so Metaceae, Eucalyptus, Leptospermum, that sort of thing. Some of the native peas, Proteaceae, Banksia, that sort of thing. So yeah, try to get a lot of our native plants planted.
Fantastic message. And James, from you, what's your message for people to go away and do differently to help the bees?
Well, Katya and Julian got my first choice. So my second choice is probably chemicals. So chemicals, particularly pesticides, are bad news for bees. So really try to avoid them if you possibly can. And if you have to use them, try to use them in a bee-friendly way. And there's plenty of advice on how to do that.
Fantastic. Look, thanks so much. That's a great message to end up on. So thank you very much, everybody. And Candace is going to just play the Australian Pollinator Week theme song with some beautiful photos to just end this evening's webinar. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, bye.
Where are you, Candace? You coming? Caught her on the hop, obviously. Thank you.
Where grevilleas grow and basil blooms. It's Pollinator Week and it's coming to you. Do they have 4 wings or do they have 2? Where their eyes are placed. Now that's the real clue. So take a walk, bring a pen. When the flowers smell sweet, who will you meet this Pollinator Week?
Red rocket in orbit above the city, reading the landscape in the language of UV. An aviator asks,
Rita, what is it you see?
eucalypts to eat and lantana to sleep. Pollinator, pollinator, is that a reed bee that I see? Pollinator, pollinator, who will you meet this Pollinator Week? Suspended midair wearing black and yellow jeans, from aviator goggles observing the scene. But how are you flying with only 2 wings?
I just hold my halters and hover for a bit.
Pollinator,
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 is that a hoverfly that I see?
look, look.
Pollinator,
Pollinator,
pollinator, who will you meet this Pollinator Week? Wings held up on a Pisidia, she's perched. Meet Priscilla, queen of the dessert. Unfurls her proboscis like a patty puff of straw. With pollen-studded roots she carries on the tour. Pollinator, pollinator, is that the butterfly that I see?
pollinator,
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 pollinator.
who will you meet this Pollinator Week?
Woo!
A glint below from big green eyes, blue band to you to match the skies. Checking out the pollen of the Dianella, 50 times a second 'cause she's a head banger. Pollinator, pollinator, is that a blue-banded bee that I see?
Pollinator,
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 pollinator.
who will you meet this Pollinator Week? Flying forever over strawberry fields, Prudence spreads pollen, growing the yield. Something in the way it moves so loosely in the sky makes it look like diamonds to kaleidoscopic eyes. Pollinator,
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 hey jewel beetle that I see. Pollinator,
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 pollinator.
who will you meet this Pollinator Week? Fast, efficient, slender and sleek. Sarah may look angry, but she's scanning for a treat. Speeding through the sky, knitting pollen as she goes, eliminating aphids, assisting veggie growth. Pollinator, pollinator, is that a paper wasp that I see? Pollinator, pollinator, who will you meet this Pollinator Week? Shh, now it's quiet and Rita's sleeping tight. Nick searching for sweetness amongst the city lights. Perfumed petals gleaming white as snow, tempted by the smell.
Blinded by the glow.
Pollinator, pollinator, is that a hawk moth that I see? Pollinator,
Thank you, everyone. And that concludes this evening's presentation.